think we can kick off. Welcome everyone to today's Spencer webinar, Winning Approaches to Big Losses, Jeff Cohen and Jim Blinn of Zywave. My name is Rachel Lieblein-Gerbala. I'm the programs manager at the Spencer Educational Foundation. My pronouns are she, her. And just as a quick introduction to the Spencer Educational Foundation, for those of you who are less familiar, our mission is to fund the education of tomorrow's risk management and insurance leaders. And we're so excited to be offering this webinar series for current students and recent grads who are interested in the risk management and insurance industry. This is the fifth webinar in our 10-part summer webinar sessions. So we've officially hit our halfway mark. So thanks so much for all the familiar faces. Welcome back. And to those who are new, thanks for coming. I have a couple of housekeeping notes before we kick off. The first is, again, if you haven't heard this from me already, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself in the chat with your name, where you're calling in from, and your university or organization, that would be fantastic. I would love to see and meet you all. Second piece is that this meeting is being recorded, so it will be available on the Spencer Educational Foundation's website after the fact if you want to revisit any information there, or share the link with any of your friends who weren't able to make it today. And then the last piece is that Jeff and Jim will be making this an interactive session as much as possible here. So if you wouldn't mind and are comfortable, putting on your video is always fantastic. We love to see faces, and there will be some questions asked throughout that if you're willing to unmute yourself and answer those questions from Jeff and Jim, we warmly invite you to do so. Also, again, if you're not comfortable doing that, please feel free to use the chat function as well, and we can maneuver that as well, Jeff and Jim, I think. But please feel free. This is a safe space. We welcome you to answer or ask any questions, answer any questions as you feel comfortable doing so. And with that, it's time to briefly introduce our two presenters, Jeff and Jim. Jeff Cohen is Senior Vice President at Zywave, where he joined in January 2021 after Zywave's acquisition of Advisen at the end of 2020. Jeff is a current Spencer board member. He joined in September of 2018, I believe, Jeff. Jim Blinn is currently the Executive Vice President of Client Solutions at Zywave. He has over 30 years of experience in the property casualty insurance industry. Jim is also part of the Spencer family and was on the Spencer board from 2007 to 2016. And with that, Jeff and Jim, thank you so much for being here. So excited for your presentation today. I will hand the floor over to you.
Great. Well, maybe that's a good time for me to at least start sharing the screen, and then I'll bet you that Jeff is going to say lots of cool things as we get going here.
Well, I'm still sort of giggling to myself at the very clever title we gave Rachel months ago when we were thinking about this webinar. Winning approaches to big losses, and then, that morphed into, how do risk professionals leverage loss event data for risk assessment? Obviously, the topic that we'll spend, the next 45 minutes or so going through. For further background, I should share with all of you that Jeff and Jim met at Advisen. Advisen is a company that got started in the summer of 2000, and by, call it 2010, we were chasing this crusade of capturing as much loss event data as possible across, all sorts of publicly referenceable material. And we'll talk more about this. That became one of the principal assets that Zywave saw. And when they started talking to us, probably the beginning of 2020, ultimately Advisen was sold to Zywave. And that is why you see on the screen Advisen, a Zywave company. So today, Jim and I are, full-time employees of this new parent company, Zywave. Company's based in Milwaukee with operations really globally. A group of people in Milwaukee, a large group of people in Texas, another group of people with us in New York, a group of people in London, and a big offshore team in the Philippines. So today, Zywave is an organization probably surpassing 900 employees, and we are out to change sort of the way that insurance professionals as a whole make risk and insurance decisions. A large crop ofZywave's customer base are insurance brokers, but we have a huge footprint in the carrier space, as well as sort of the HCM space, which is human capital management. Think of it as almost everything that is not an insurance carrier or an insurance broker. But everything we do is sort of aimed at that risk profile. So that's my opening salvo. Jim, you want to add to that?
I think that's a good start, man. Certainly look forward to adding some more sort of background stuff as we kind of progress in the discussion here. But you know.
So why don't we tell you what we are setting out to accomplish? You know, Rachel told you that this is the 5th webinar in the series. So Jim and I spent some time trying to figure out how could we make this more impactful and more entertaining than the previous webinars. And so this is what we came up with. We're going to send you away with this purpose on this next slide, with this idea that if we accomplish, this sort of understanding of what's in store here, it would be easier for you to sort of receive this information, digest it, process it, and so forth. So let's spend some time, sort of walking through, sort of these 2 questions. Jim, you want to?
Yeah. So well, also I think that maybe one of the things that I'll even back up on relative to the discussion that Jeff had earlier is that we originally were focusing on underwriters as kind of this, and so we've given this presentation and had this discussion with underwriting groups. But as we looked at the list of attendees today, really represents sort of the 3 major sort of groups of organizations involved in risk management today, including, people, risk professionals working for, companies that buy insurance, brokers helping to place it, as well as then, insurance companies too. And so we broadened out the discussion here to be risk professionals. And then secondly, we thought about this process of risk assessment, where risk assessment varies by where you sit relative to kind of the risk management process, either in a carrier, broker, or risk or buyer, if you will. And so I guess part of the thing that we were interested in discussing today is really this whole process of risk assessment, and what goes on relative to from where you're sitting, the risk assessment process, and then secondly, how you go about it, and then what data you use to support that. And so that was one of our major purposes. And then secondly, since we have a perspective, providing loss data for helping on the risk assessment process, wanted to kind of explore that a little bit further as well. So that's as we thought about the purpose, it's a little bit more background on what we had in mind here today, and how we're hoping to engage in the discussion too.
So let's skip ahead to the next slide and let's dig into risk assessment. Why bother? What's the goal? What are you thinking about when a risk is presented? If you are at an insured, a very large corporation, reviewing your risk profile, why try to assess, what your future risk might be? If you are a insurance carrier, what I'll call a manufacturer of insurance, why do you care about what are the types of things that could go on in some sort of policyholders, operation? And certainly if you're a broker, what are you thinking about when it comes to risk assessment? What are some of your initial thoughts? And it's not a rhetorical question, it's an interactive question. So what types of things might you be thinking if you sit in one of those camps?
Right. And the good news is now we've got your names and where you're at from your chat notes. We're going to be calling on people if we don't get some some thoughts from you all.
I think Jim aspires to be like a college professor. So
this is true, actually. Yes.
If you had a seating chart, you'd be really at home.
We've got something close to that here, don't we? So.
No, really. What are your thoughts out there? No such thing as a bad answer or a wrong answer. What are you thinking? give us some material to work with.
Yeah.
You have to click off mute though.
Well, I think it's time for us to call out. I'm thinking Katie Williams there, who's an interning at the Port of Portland. So Katie, if you got some thoughts here that within the port there, how what are some of the issues that the port thinks about relative to the risk assessment process and the types of risks you're trying to identify? And you can take yourself off mute too, please.
Hey there, guys. This is Nora Zaid.
Hey.
Sorry, I was waiting
Right,
for
Nora.
Katie, but
Yeah.
I'm just going to go ahead and ask.
Go for it.
So
Yes.
just to be sure that I get the right question, you're basically asking what are some of the issues with the process of risk assessment?
Well, even more broadly, I think, why think about, sort of risk assessment? What's the aim of it? When you think about what types of issues could confront, a policy holder, what's the point?
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, it's kind of like a common sense that once you assess the risks that your company or even in your own household that you may face, so you would be able to choose the right policy for when you want, to cover those stuff, right? I don't know. I mean, in my head, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think that's a terrific answer, and it certainly allows us to build on a bunch of different aspects, right? Like,
right.
one of the things that is commonplace in this business is that no matter what seat you sit in, you tend to look at risk as what are the things that have happened in the past, and could they happen again in the future. So there's certainly this notion of recurrence, right? And people will talk about this is a 1 in 100-year event. This is a 1 in 1 year event. Like, this goes on all the time. If you operate a fleet of trucks, and it's a large fleet of trucks, human beings have a habit of getting into trouble and causing accidents. And so you can begin to predict a certain frequency with a certain amount of data, and that's definitely a form of risk assessment. What about the things that are, say, less frequent? How do you, why spend so much time contemplating the things that could go wrong if they never have?
Right. I mean, it's obvious because one of the stuff that happened that nobody saw it coming was COVID, right?
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, that's a classic example. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So if you're sitting in a seat where you have to assess risk and the types of things that could go wrong, what happens when you start thinking about what I'll call, slightly intangible risk factors like a pandemic? How does that influence your views? What types of thoughts do you have there?
That's an interesting question.
And we're happy to have anybody else chime in.
Yeah.
Right.
Nicole, I saw your hand was raised.
Yeah, I was just gonna go back to the previous conversation we were having about just within risk, there's just a lot of uncertainty, and like the probability of things happening are just kind of unknown sometimes. And like with things that don't happen as frequently, just because they don't happen as frequently doesn't mean they aren't that severe. So planning for the correct risk, and even though you just need to compare like the frequency and severity, how often is it going to occur, how much money is it going to cost us. Even though it's happening frequency, maybe it's not going to cost us that much, but the severity of our whole entire building catching on fire, that's going to cost us a lot, even though the risk of that is probably slim. So you just have to prepare for the risk as best as possible, even though things are uncertain, but you have to plan as best as you can.
Yeah, listen, I think you are singing with the choir here. We are completely in agreement with you, Nicole. There is the fascinating aspects of, how does frequency, dovetail with severity, right? And that is something that every insurance professional is constantly aware of. If you use my fleet of trucks example, I imagine some CFO can, get to a level, if you have 10,000 vehicles on the road, it's a matter of clockwork that, the frequency is going to be rather regular in terms of something happening, a fender bender, somebody took the wrong left turn and smashed into something, whatever. The notion of severity, though, is a very different notion, right? Like, how often does a loss event become so severe that it sort of disrupts at a minimum the financial trajectory of the organization, right? Not only do we have to pay some multi-million-dollar lawsuit, we are now going to see our quarterly earnings get corrupted. We're going to not be able to afford the budget expansion change that we were doing. Forget about the actual, if it involves loss of life or something like that. So there's a huge context of frequency here, and by the same notion, severity, and those two things operate differently. And I also want to go back to a previous comment. The answer isn't always an insurance policy as a solution. The answer could be some sort of training program to help employees operate differently. The answer could be some sort of alternative transfer scheme. There are a lot of different ways for risk professionals to weigh in on, now that we figured out what the risk is, now that we properly assessed it, what should we do to prepare? And, look, Jim and I are both, parents of children who are now tax-paying, members of society. So our children are slightly older. But along the way of being a parent, I think you're making similar decisions. Okay, this is a problem, but how significant of a problem is it for my child to do this? Whether it's to, well, I won't even go into the examples of things that my children did, but I'll simply suggest that, once again, as a parent, you're constantly assessing the implications of behavior, which I would argue are classic risk assessment paradigms, right? Now I happen to work, Jim and I work for an organization with 900 employees. So 900 employees are traveling and meeting with clients and doing all these other things. And if we were in charge of the risk potential, we would be looking at, interactions. How does our company interact with our clients? What are the different things? What are the assets? How do we protect them? Our people, and I will continually share my bias that human beings are very creative when it comes to getting into trouble. Then you have property issues, things associated with structures and buildings and vehicles and so forth. And you have issues associated with data, which is something that our business is very focused on, and we'll talk more about that. So, all right, so if that's sort of our notion of risk assessment with the goal to identify where the problems could be of tomorrow, what are some of the strategies that you would suggest we employ to identify those things? What's available to us right now? What, starting with, and I'll throw it out there, Google, right? What types of things can you do to figure out what types of strategies are out there to identify, all of these potential hazards?
Right. And certainly, I'd be interested too. It's just any comments that that you all might have relative to, in your internships that you're involved in, or potentially some of your classwork. What it is that what your involvement is in risk assessment right now.
So, and you threw out into the chat, historical data, as you mentioned before. And we're going to spend some time talking about that. Why don't we push you to be incrementally more specific about the historical data that you mean? What types of historical data might be more impactful to your review versus other types of historical data?
I have a comment to make. So my internship is in property management.
Cool.
We operate 55,000 apartment units throughout the United States, and our corporate office is in San Diego. So we're not always able to go on site and look at properties.
Right.
So some of the way that we assess and select what risks we're going to take is through third-party inspections.
Oh, okay.
So we actually leverage a few different inspection companies to travel and look at individual properties, but also when we're acquiring apartment homes and stuff like that, we actually leverage environmental site assessments as well as property and zoning assessments. So it allows us to analyze, risk that would be different policies we take on for environmental, or whether let's say, for example, we're looking at properties in Florida or Texas, environmental is going to be more of an issue. So what insurance policies we're going to take on in that aspect.
Mm-hmm. So does that information, have you heard about it? It's often, or does it ever lead to a decision of just avoiding the risk, as in you're not buying the properties or making an investment?
Oh, by far, exactly. Yeah. So there are times where we actually gather some of that information and properties are overlooked. Sometimes we are able to, purchase insurance based on that information, or just self-insure. So exactly.
Yeah, so I think that's really a great example of sort of risk assessment in action relative to the information you gather, and then the decisions that you make based upon the information that you have relative to the risk treatment that you'd apply, including avoiding it totally.
Having thoroughly reviewed the situation, we've decided to take a pass.
Yep. Any other comments that you all have? Or
our company during the COVID, they used to do in-person safety assessments for their locations. And since COVID started, they implemented virtual assessments. They're not as effective, as in you can't really, they can't kind of carry the laptop around, pretty much, and show that.
Really, so somebody walks around with a laptop and sort of shows what it looks like. Really?
Yeah. Well, you're like a camera, but it's you can't really build relationships as well. But hopefully, with the COVID being over, the safety team will be able to go out there. But the company also implements PSAs for the employees and stuff, for like the safety PSAs, and they actually implemented this new system called Smart Drive for their different shuttle buses that they use. So it helps with litigation processes or whatever else. So that's.
So what is the business you're with?
Oh, I apologize. SB Plus Corporation. It's I'm interning there this summer. Yeah. They employ valet services, shuttle bus services for airport locations, parking.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So they do. I mean, they. And with the Smart Drive system, I'm with the safety team. You see some crazy, videos, and then like with accidents.
Well,
happening.
That's
so it's
proving Jeff Cohen's theory about people are infinitely creative in terms of how they could do this.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but it did help a lot with cutting their losses and helping implement different safety procedures based on what they see on the video, or employees using a phone while driving. It helps.
Absolutely. You're referencing, a situation that really reminds me of one of my favorite sort of risk assessment, risk selection types of examples, where I think it's UPS, where they determined that their drivers get into accidents at 6 times the regular rate when they make left-hand turns. So company policy is no left-hand turns while you're in our vehicle, which is a way of mitigating a potential problem, right? It's like, okay, this is happening at a greater than normal frequency, and we can reduce it with a company policy, not an insurance policy, but a company procedure. So there are so many creative ways to lower a risk profile once you properly assess it. And I think
and then you could bring it up. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
And I was going to say, you could bring it up to the insurance companies to show that these are the steps you're using, and these are the steps that you're kind of using to mitigate those risks. To get maybe better pricing on your coverage.
Oh, you better believe it. You better believe it. Every savvy policyholder is going to hold out the proverbial smoke detector, which is to say, I have this and I do this, I implemented this, and I operate this way. So my risk profile when you do your assessment of me, should find that it's lower than what you thought. And by the same token, the insurance company is doing the same thing back to their reinsurance carrier, helping to explain how they make risk assessment decisions so that the reinsurer is more comfortable. Absolutely, 100%.
Right. So there's some great comments. Any other experiences people have had? I know some of you are working at brokers. I see, particularly Arthur J. Gallagher. Any sort of experiences that you've had, you know, from the side of working at brokerage firm this summer here? While we're waiting, I'm going to add my own personal risk assessment. So I'm in northwestern Connecticut, and yesterday and the day before, we had lost power for 24 hours when a thunderstorm came through, and one's coming through or will be coming through. So, Jeff Cohen, I'm giving you a heads up that you may at some point need to take over.
So when you suddenly exit the meeting,
yeah, it's like bye.
We won't take it. We won't take it personally.
Right.
Well, let's keep rolling with our
sure.
With our you know, kind of slides here. You know, I think this notion of, you know, how do risk professionals get smart about a new company or an industry sort of, you know, extends this notion one further increment. It's this idea of, you know, inevitably, if you think about that insurance carrier, that underwriter who's now presented a new submission from a broker, this particular company, ABC Corp, Acme Widget, what have you, wants, you know, $10 million of limit, and you're like, how do I figure out what's going on beyond, you know, what the broker is telling me in the application? And certainly you have to be sensitive to this type of approach as well. If you are the potential policyholder, how are your risk profiles not only presented by the broker in the application, but also is that the way you want, you know, some underwriter to review things? Can anybody share any comments here with regard to things that you would do automatically to get smart about a company, to figure out what else might be involved beyond what you're seeing in the data submitted to you via the application? Anybody have a go-to resource or something like that?
There's not a go-to resource, but maybe asking around, like asking people who have been in that industry or people who have worked for that company or are working for that company to see their perspective of things.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Nicole. I think there's a huge ability to learn more about a company by talking to people. It's no different than the description of, you know, before we take on an extra property risk, we actually look at the building. You know, most companies, I hope, would you know, stand up and tell you that their greatest asset are their people, and people are pretty smart when it comes to knowing what are the potential pitfalls for what types of things could go wrong. So if you have an opportunity to talk to people, absolutely. Current employees, former employees, and the bigger the company is, the more there are people out there, including industry analysts and all sorts of literature on a company. If a company's publicly traded, it's a whole nother plethora of documents and details provided by the company to the public, all creating great material to go through and look for certain things. What else could we add to this category quickly? And then we'll
I see Madeline put in a comment here about LinkedIn, you know, going to LinkedIn, which is definitely a great source of information about the company, and as you're saying, about their values around risk management too. So
yeah, my expectation is that many of the people who are interns on this call are using LinkedIn to learn more about the counterparts that they're working with. And, you know, Jeff and Jim, you know, I'll simply acknowledge that we're older than you are. And Jeff and Jim are looking at LinkedIn and comparing LinkedIn notes all day long as well.
Right.
So it's a phenomenal tool. You know, I'm using it to look at clients, look at prospects, look at companies on both sides of the equation. That really hasn't changed, it's just become more so.
Yeah. And I'd also add, the other things that that we've seen people use, like even Glassdoor, again, is just a way to understand what type of place is this, and how do they treat their employees? Because it's really a great source of insight based on generally pretty unfiltered views about an organization and a place to work. So,
Yeah, and I'll just augment on that, and then we'll move on. This notion of the concept of Yelp reviews, and I don't mean just simply Yelp. I mean the idea of crowdsourcing information where people have visited an establishment, they've gone to a restaurant, they've left their clothes at the dry cleaner, whatever it might be. People now leave reviews, and those reviews can also be very telling about a business, and that customer experience. Mark my words, you'll remember I said it years from now, that customer experience will have a greater impact on people's ability to assess risk in the future than current, and it will rise with a bullet because there's great ability to sense what types of problems when you have the customer complaining about a meal that was not cooked the right way over and over again, or some sort of delivery of service that didn't go the way it was promised. Watch for that stuff to rise.
So why don't we switch gears here, Jeff Cohen, talk about loss data a little bit.
Yeah, so why don't you introduce the topic of loss data in sort of the concept of what types of things are people able to access now, and then why don't we share a little bit about what we've been doing. And then maybe we'll go to some examples and we'll get into some of the fun stuff.
Cool, yeah. Or hopefully it'll be fun for everybody here. So as we think about data again, we were just going through a lot of different sources, and data is often unstructured. You think about going to Google or LinkedIn or something like that, where you're getting information that is important in terms of a risk assessment process. The part of the challenge, though, often is that in assembling that, is if you truly are trying to do some sort of a frequency and severity analysis, it's pretty challenging. Also, another thing that I've seen people use, which I wouldn't necessarily call external data, but again, I'd like to use this as a point of comparison. Often in risk assessments, I've seen companies use voting, okay, so that they might get a bunch of experts in a room. They would, ask about, okay, for this particular risk, how many people think it'd be severe versus not, how often will it happen? And through that voting technology, they might come up with a risk assessment. Often that leads you to a red, yellow, green, or something as informal as that. And the challenge often on that is where you don't have true external data, is that it's often the person with the loudest voice who's going to sway a person or sway the view of the group relative to this. So that's why we believe, that Jeff and I do, that external data is really a critical source of this, or sometimes internal data. And so so we've got some examples of data that are available. You take like commodity data, that could be sources that are available on the internet from different websites. You might go to government websites even that have this, so that be free. Often talking about fines, penalties that they've imposed, other things that are useful. But then data behind firewalls, there's a number of subscription services where we have one of them that is used for risk assessment. And so often you've got people who specialize in a particular type of risk. We know one individual, for example, who specializes in infrastructure risks caused by cyber things. And so he's got this incredible collection of weird things that have happened when people have hacked into buildings, into oil well platforms, and power plants, other things, describing what the impact was on those organizations. So again, he licenses that data. It's behind a firewall, but it's very valuable if you're trying to do assessments of that particular type of stuff. So Jeff, I don't know things you want to add about that, or thoughts there?
No, I think that, you're limited sometimes only in your creativity for what you can surmise. The world is a very big place. There's data all over. And odds are, if you can think it, you can find somebody out there that might have it. And now the question becomes, how accessible is it to you? Jim alludes to, data that's free or data that's, based on government regulatory bodies and things like that. Data behind a firewall becomes one of those aspects of what we call subscription data. And the fact of the matter is, it's a major way that our company makes its money, right? Like, we license the data back to companies in order for them to further their risk assessment. But the takeaway that we want you to sort of remember is this idea that there are different types of data out there that can influence how you think about risk assessment and consequently risk selection. Since I'll say it now for the third time, human beings are exceptionally creative when it comes to getting into trouble. Like, if you remember nothing else, you remember that we said that. And because of that, there's a track record of all this stuff, right? And things that have happened to a company with 100 employees, could happen again to another company that meets a similar profile. So if you have a company with 10 employees that's growing very quickly, you get to be 100 employees, and guess what? Now your risk profile takes on more of the characteristics and attributes of a risk profile of a company with 100 employees, and so on. And so you look for those, what types of things have happened, and how might it influence your view of what is possible in terms of happening in the organization that you represent, whether it's a property thing or a transportation thing, or Jim's offshore oil platform. Same idea. Let's tell you a little bit more about our proprietary data. Give you 2 seconds in terms of what we're doing to collect it. You have to imagine, a room of people offshore, 100 plus in number, who are sifting through all sorts of public documents, and they are matching it into a structured database. So whereas, when you go on Google and you pull something up, it's a thing, it's a data point. What we're trying to do is put it all into a spreadsheet so that things that are not alike can be deemed to be more alike. And what I mean by that is that, a cyber risk, a factory fire, a sexual harassment claim, all of these things can be tracked by their characteristics or their attributes. It happened to a particular company, and that company was located in a particular place, and consequently that company is associated with a certain number of employees and a certain revenue. And you begin to take data that's not the same and make it much more similar to other things. So the data can be arranged by line of business, the data can be arranged by business segment, and you can spin it on your head. So, when you could then turn around and say, okay, let's talk about companies that match to a particular SIC code or NAICS class code, or I'm just interested in the types of things that go wrong with confectionery companies. Making candy, how bad could that be? What could possibly happen? And the answer is plenty of things happen, because they've happened before. And so one of the takeaways, a corollary to humans are very creative when it comes to getting into trouble, is that there's no such thing as a perfect track record. As it turns out, all companies face certain issues. There's no such thing as a impenetrable, nothing bad has ever happened to them. It's not possible. It completely contravenes my first principle of risk profile and exposure. Jim, should we skip ahead to some of our examples?
Sure. I think so. Maybe we've sort of covered this already.
Yeah, it's the idea of taking lost data and matching it with company data in order to make that lost data more relevant.
Right. So then, so here, wow, this is interesting up here. This is a little bit of a view of all of the different cases that we have in our database today. So today it's, our researchers have identified 900,000 loss cases. And just to give you a little bit of a sense, typically it takes several hours of research to put together one of these loss cases. So think about the hundreds of thousands of man hours that have gone into putting this together. So it's represents $3.7 trillion in total economic loss. I guess if I thought about it in advance, I would have tried to figure out which economy in the world 3.7 trillion equates to, but it's a lot of money. And so what we do is we assign, as Jeff said, a line of business to each loss. And so you can see here some of the major lines of business that we have associated with the losses. And so you say, well, why do we have so many employment practices losses, for example? It's not necessarily that that's the worst thing that happens all the time to people, but rather that, it's a function of the fact that the United States Department of Labor publishes information relative to wage and hour cases. And so we have over 100,000 wage and hour cases, just by way of example. So what's a wage and hour case? It's basically that people are getting shorted relative to how much money they should be paid. For example, if you work in a restaurant, you're not getting tips or something like that. So you're getting shorted, or you work 10 hours and you're only paid for 8. That's also an example. So
I feel that way sometimes myself, where I work 12 hours. But realistically, I'm working 18 hours. But anyway.
You need to assess the value, Jeff, created in making that determination. So so this shows again on this pie chart the different types. And so as we say, it's all from public domain. And so the reality is taking that maybe it's a news story we start with, going to a court to pick out information about a lawsuit that arose out of it, finding another news story about a settlement associated with this, and putting all this together so that it's all referenceable. And so one of the things you'll see in the next pages is that it's all associated with a company, so you can see by company what we have. And so it's I doubt that some companies are excited to be resident in our database. This isn't quite like winning a prize, but it is something that we do capture and make available. Any other thoughts there, Jeffrey? Or
no, let's go on to the next example. Go ahead.
Yeah, so this is an example. So I said you can name names. So it's something we put together for describing the losses of Sealed Air Corporation that we had seen. And so this isn't to pick on Sealed Air in any way, but just simply to use this as a set of examples. Now, one of the things you can see is Sealed Air has grown through acquisitions. They've got a number of different companies here that they've bought over time. And also it's global. You can see it's Australia that they've got operations in that we've identified issues with. You can also see that we categorize the losses, starting with cyber. We have a good number of cyber losses all the way through employment, wage and hours I was talking about, products liability cases, shareholders, problems, et cetera. And so you can see the dates. And then as we think about this, the two elements we talked about, frequency, severity, this starts to give you an idea of the frequency of the different types of losses that they've experienced, as well as then severity, including one where they had a lawsuit associated with an acquisition that they ended up spending nearly $1 billion in restitution on. So it's definitely a large loss. And we think about this whole idea of how bad could things be. This is an example of how bad they could be on the severity side, as well as how often they happen on the frequency side.
Sealed Air, in my thinking, is a company based in New Jersey that makes packaging products. Think about those bubble wrap things that come in and all of those Amazon boxes that you receive where things are. That's what they're doing.
Yeah.
And now think about the size of the losses that you see all the way on that column on the right. And so this is one of hundreds of thousands of examples that we could pull to show you this idea, to reinforce this idea that all organizations encounter issues and problems. Your job as a risk professional is to be really good at figuring out, assessing what the issues might be, and then thinking about part two, which is, okay, if these are the types of things that could occur, what are we prepared to do proactively about it? And that may mean employing some sort of insurance mitigation solution, buying coverage, doing something that says, okay, this could happen. And if it does happen, it will create a financial pitfall in our plans, a pothole that will totally disrupt our trajectory. Let's invoke some sort of insurance solution, but there are plenty of other ways to address this as well. And that's sort of the overarching theme of our, winning approaches to utilizing, loss data. It's this idea of how does it help inform your view as a risk professional?
Right. I'll add as an aside, this isn't necessarily all the losses that Sealed Air has experienced, but it's certainly some of the significant ones, the ones that made the press that we've gone out and captured as well.
So let's reinforce this thought now with a comparison between Sealed Air and the industry subset, Jim.
Yeah, it looks like some of our colors fell off the map here, Jeff. But so this shows what we did is we just simply created a pie chart based on the prior page of the different things that Sealed Air is subject to, and then over here, plus or minus the missing things, is sort of all the companies that are similar. So we looked across their industry using SIC codes as a way to find comparable organizations. So here with Sealed Air, you can see that we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different categories of loss. And here, this one is all other. There's a lot of different things that could happen. So the idea is that, through the risk assessment process, looking at comparable organizations, you expand your universe of loss types and of bad things that could happen to a particular company.
Yeah, I think this is all about looking at information in a context, and the context being, what do other organizations, what do other companies, things that look the same, what's their experience? And I would argue that in every assessment approach, this notion of what's happening with my peers, what's happening with my competitors, following news stories and litigation occurring for companies that are sort of like you or companies that you aspire to be like, is probably one of the more productive ways that you can further your ability to perform risk assessment.
Right. And then just to kind of show you a little bit more, this is gives some examples of companies like Sealed Air that have had losses. And so again, what the idea is that not only do you want to see sort of the high level attributes, often it's useful to actually read about what happened here. And so this, if you're familiar, for example, on this first example of NotPetya, the ransomware attack that occurred in 2017, it crippled a number of companies around the globe. It was estimated to have a $10 billion global impact. And so this is a single company, the Reckitt Bank, I can't even pronounce it, group, that had a $142 million impact arising out of this. And so it is it's sort of an example of the types of bad things that could happen here. And then similarly, we've got a trademark or infringement lawsuit that another similar company experienced that was $45 million. And so it's helpful, not only to have that breadth of types of losses, but then also the examples of really large losses that companies have experienced as well, that we find, through the descriptions, et cetera.
So where does that leave all of you people? I think when Jim and I, first received the invitation from Megan and Rachel to present to all of you, our thought was, how could we share something, about, sort of the stuff that we live and breathe every day, and leave you with some memorable impact on, your immediate, next steps, your career potential, and so on. And so for us, it became this sort of juxtaposition around thinking about what could happen based on inputs like this. I will also tell you that, I'm sure many of you have heard the refrain that, being an insurance professional, that's not going to win you great kudos at your next cocktail party, blah, 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 blah. Now, I would tell you that, as it turns out, I think some of the people involved in this industry are some of the most exciting people to talk to at a cocktail party.
Yes.
I'm sure all of my friends share my views. I will tell you that this approach of thinking, right, can lead you into one of two possible dimensions. And I'll go back to my earlier remarks about being a parent, right? You can take this to the nth degree and become so overly cautious that you don't take any risk at all. And I would suggest to you that that's not the right approach. It's a measure of balanced risk, which gets you ahead, both in terms of what you decide to do with your lives and how you decide to make an impact on this greater society. The fact of the matter is that Jim and I both grew up in households where we rode in the back seat of our parents' cars without a seatbelt. And we probably went bicycle riding around the neighborhood a million years ago, not wearing a helmet. Today, we know that there are risks associated with that behavior, and you can do minor things to minimize the risk. By no stretch of the imagination do Jim or I aspire to be the type of parent that says, I'm going to raise my children by locking them in a room so nothing bad happens to them. It's all about taking appropriate risks. And I would suggest to all of you, it's the same approach in both your careers and your next steps as a risk professional. And if anything, we wanted to leave you with a sense about how will you think about what information is out there. And if you know what types of information are out there, how can you come closer to leveraging it in any way, shape, or form? What types of research can you do? This whole idea of talking to other people who have worked at the company or previously worked at the company, all of those types of approaches are all absolutely correct as you try to gather as much information to then determine, okay, what could go wrong? And if it does go wrong, what are we prepared to do about it? And the answer to that second question may be nothing. It's worth the experience of riding around the block without a helmet. It's the risk that you take. All right, so let's stop here. We have a few minutes left to take some questions, happily entertain comments, jokes, funny remarks. All of that stuff works for us. I don't know.
Jeff, I have a two-part question for you. So I had the opportunity to read your bio and saw that you went to school for biology. So how was your journey from, getting a BA in biology to ending up in risk management? And then the other part is,
I often wondered the same. That's a great question, Alexander. Good question.
And then the other part of that question is, what advice do you have for upcoming risk management professionals?
Well, I'll tell you what, Alexander. I'll take the first question and I'll pass it over to Jim for the second part of the question. So the answer, the strict answer to your question is absolutely nothing. But if you delve back, I will tell you that, two things. I was originally, pre-med in my undergrad, and that didn't necessarily work out for me. And one of the things that I realized is that I really am fascinated by human behavior and why human beings make decisions, which is why I enjoyed my biology major. As it turns out, there are more plants in this office than a normal office. I'm fascinated by houseplants. I've never met a houseplant I didn't like. And I've continued to come to this office to water my plants because I have so many of them here. I'm not willing to sacrifice them, which is why I'm in the office today. But realistically, responding to your question, this is all about how do human beings decide what to do? And I think the parallels between my biology background and that are very, well correlated. So that's my best answer for you. I love this industry and I love being a part of it, and I love helping other people to appreciate the types of thought that people in this industry who are really good at it have. With regard to career advice, I'll pass the baton to Mr. Blinn, who's had many more years of sort of Spencer participation than I have, and see what's on his mind.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah. Thanks for that many more years, Jeffrey. You're not that much younger than me. So I guess my advice is I've always enjoyed learning, and I've always enjoyed finding out new things and reading about things that impact businesses as well as people. And my advice is to put yourself in a position where you can constantly be exposed to new things, because the world is always changing. If you have particular expertise today, that expertise probably isn't going to be that helpful in a few years. And so that you've got to continually be reading about different things and, preparing yourself for, this evolving world. So that could be working at a brokerage at different types of, working with different accounts. It could be, working at, an insurance company, going through a series of different departments in the company. And so that there's a lot of ways you can expose yourself to things. And certainly, I think that, being involved with Spencer as well is just what Spencer does. Like these types of educational sessions is again, just a tremendous example of, how you can continue that learning journey that you go through during your career process.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. What else?
I have a quick question for you, Jeff. I also read your bio and said that you worked in the marketing and that area. Sorry. What advice would you give to set yourself apart from other people who are working in that area? Like, what do you do to set yourself apart from the other person? Because everybody's pretty smart. You're working against somebody that's good at this company and good at that company. So what would you recommend to set yourself apart from somebody else?
Look, I happen to think that the issues associated with differentiation are harder for your generation than they were for ours. Now there are, a million really smart kids and up and coming people who want to join the job market. And so my best advice is differentiation at every turn. The only way to really separate yourself from the pack is to accentuate the things that make you unique. Leverage them, tout them, talk about them. I think my colleagues both at Zywave, as well as my colleagues on the board at Spencer, are well aware of some of the larger and perhaps more superficial things that I'm always trying to do to make myself memorable and sticky. All of us have the experience of, that email that as soon as you see it, you forget it, that voicemail that's like just one of 1,000 voicemails that's left on your cell phone. And my question to everybody I work with is, what can you do to make that piece of what you just tried to convey linger just an incremental additional second? What can you, and I think a lot of that comes down to the easiest way to differentiate something is to inject your personality into it. I'd like to believe that, when Jim and I do presentations like this, you're walking away with maybe not a stated idea of who we are as people, but you've got a good sense, having listened to us banter on for an hour. And by the way, we usually talk to people like we're an old married couple, and we really toned it down for all of you, but just layering in some of those aspects so that you can be like, I remember they said this. That's what we're going for. And I think you have to do the same thing.
Thank you.
And with that, I think we're at the top of the hour, and I see my next webcam call has started. Jim,
Same here. Absolutely. So, running on. So guys, thank you so much.
Jeff and Jim, thank you both. I want to, Jim, do you have any last thoughts? I don't want to cut you off here before we close.
No, I think Jeff did a great job of summarizing. I'm always in awe of his skills in this area. So.
Truly an old married
couple. Tell me your Venmo account. I'll hit you later.
Yeah, really.
Fantastic.
All right, everybody. Great to see you all. Thanks for joining.
So much.
Yeah, good luck with your careers, everybody, too. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jeff and Jim, for joining us today. We are so grateful to have you. For those of you who are on the call right now, thanks for sticking with us for this full hour, and we hope to see you next week for our session on Thursday. Again, the session next week is entitled Why Companies Should Focus on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and will be presented by Rodney Johnson, Divisional Vice President of Culture and Inclusion at Gallagher. So I hope to see you again next week, and thank you so much for sticking with us today. Nice to see you all.
So long.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.